Welcome to This Explainer. We're going to unravel a mystery that pretty much haunts every workplace on the planet. You know the drill, right? You try to cut red tape, encourage open communication, focus on the long term, and then boom, you drift right back into bureaucracy and short-term thinking. Why does that happen? Well, today we are unpacking some truly fascinating research that explains exactly why. And spoiler alert, it's not just a sign of bad management, it's actually a systemic pull. So let's dive into the invisible physics of the workplace, the laws of organizational gravity.
Okay, let's look at a stark contrast we've probably all lived through. Up in the boardroom at the end of a quarter, it's this beautiful illusion of control. The dashboard's a sea of green. Leaders think they've perfectly delegated authority. Everyone's high-fiving over a new simplification program. But then you look down at the front line, and it is a completely different reality. Managers are still kicking routine decisions way up the chain because the rules are just too vague. Teams are secretly running their own duplicate spreadsheets because, the official system is basically useless, and every new crisis just adds another layer of paperwork. The craziest part is, neither view is technically a lie. They're just experiencing two totally different ends of the exact same system.
So what actually creates this massive gap between the boardroom and the front line? The source material we're looking at defines it as organizational gravity, and I absolutely love how this frames the problem. It's not just about lazy employees or out-of-touch executives. No, it's an invisible field created by unequal distributions or asymmetries in authority, information, and consequence. Think about it. Just like physical gravity pulls an apple straight to the ground, organizational gravity naturally pulls human behavior in a very specific, totally predictable direction.
Now, here is the absolutely crucial point. Organizational gravity does not pull a company toward the smartest, most efficient, or even the safest choice. It pulls it toward the response that is institutionally easiest to justify. When the pressure is on and things are uncertain, people and systems just naturally drift toward whatever they can easily defend in a meeting or an audit, even if it literally contradicts the actual main goal of the organization.
Moving right along to Section 1, the 6 forces of gravity, how organizations drift.
To really understand this gravitational field, we need to break it down. Force number 1, decisions climb. Look, we've all seen a decision that was supposed to be handled locally suddenly and mysteriously wind up on the CEO's desk, right? Why? Well, because authority is ambiguous, but the punishment for getting it wrong is highly concentrated on one person. When an employee isn't 100% sure they have permission to act, or they know they're going to be hung out to dry if a reasonable guess goes wrong, bumping that decision up the chain isn't an act of cowardice. It's a completely rational act of professional self-protection.
I want you to take a second and actually think about your own workplace. Which decisions are formally delegated on paper, but repeatedly escalate up the chain in practice? If a manager realizes that delaying a project for 3 weeks just to get a VP's signature feels way safer than making a reasonable judgment call today, well, that's Force 1 in action. That right there is protection escalation.
Next up is Force 2, information reassures. This one brilliantly illustrates how a major crisis can brew right under leadership's nose. Imagine a frontline worker spots a process that is actively dangerous. As they report it upward, it has to be translated to fit into dashboards and risk registers, right? So that raw, urgent hazard gets categorized as an issue, which then gets smoothed out into a risk, which eventually hits the executive summary as a mere variance within tolerance. The warning wasn't explicitly denied, it was just systematically softened, because passing bad news up the chain is socially and professionally costly.
So ask yourself this, what is the exact journey of a difficult truth in your organization? Between the exact moment a frontline employee realizes something is terribly wrong and the moment it finally reaches the executive team, what happens to it? If your culture unintentionally rewards reassurance over candor, the true meaning of that evidence will be fundamentally altered or just entirely lost by the time it hits the top.
That brings us to Force 3, exposure descends. The source text calls this an exposure inversion, and it's a huge one. Basically, the power to define a decision becomes completely detached from the burden of actually living with it. The authority, the status, the credit for a shiny new initiative, all of that floats upward to senior management. Meanwhile, the actual heavy lifting, the confusing exceptions to the rules, and the heavy consequences of implementing the whole shebang, all of that gets pushed downward onto operational teams, or even outward onto the customers themselves.
All right, let's jump to Section 2. The accretion ratchet. Force 4, structures accumulate.
Now, let's look at what happens when things go wrong and organizations try to fix them. It operates kind of like a mechanical ratchet that only turns in one direction, creating this massive buildup of bureaucracy over time. Step 1, a highly visible failure happens, like a data leak, and everyone demands action. Step 2, leadership introduces a new, heavy approval process just to prove they're taking it seriously. Now, fast forward to step 3, years later. The original threat is completely gone. But if you remove that control and a failure happens, you get all the blame. If you keep the useless control, well, the cost is just spread out as everyday friction. So you hit step 4. The temporary fix becomes a permanent, immortal structure. Basically, adding controls proves action, but removing them forces one visible person to own all the risk.
Moving on to Force 5, the present consumes the future. Look, it's super common for leaders to set aside budgets and teams for long-term exploration and innovation, but immediate operational failure, that has a specific date, an owner, and a very loud audience. The loss of future capability, on the other hand, is silent and gradual. So what always happens? An urgent crisis hits, and the innovation team gets yanked in to put out today's fire. Short-term pressures will constantly cannibalize resources meant for the future, simply because the present screams while the future only whispers. And our final force, Force 6, legitimacy displaces purpose. Because organizations simply can't wait years to know if a strategy is working, they rely on proxies and metrics they can measure today. The real danger here is when hitting the target becomes the point, rather than fulfilling the actual purpose. It is infinitely easier to show an auditor that 100% of your staff completed a compliance module than it is to prove the company is actually a safer place to work. Auditable signs of success displace actual value. Which brings us to Section 3, when gravity causes disasters, high-stakes consequences. Now, these aren't just annoying little office quirks. At scale, these forces can be genuinely catastrophic. The 2003 loss of the Space Shuttle Columbia is a deeply tragic illustration of this. The official investigation revealed that Force 2, information reassures, was deeply embedded. Past anomalies were viewed as acceptable risks rather than urgent warnings. Force 5, the present consumes the future, narrowed the window for proper investigation because of intense, immediate schedule pressures. And on paper, all the formal assurance processes looked incredibly robust, but they essentially just masked deep technical uncertainty. The system naturally pulled toward what was institutionally defensible, with absolutely devastating results. The text also examines the UK's Windrush scandal to demonstrate these systemic forces operating at a state level. Here, we see Force 3, exposure descends, in a big way. The state sets strict rules for acceptable proof, but completely transferred the massive burden of actually finding that proof onto individuals. We also see Force 6, legitimacy displaces purpose, where meeting internal evidential thresholds became far more prioritized than resolving the actual human cases. And again, information reassures. Clear evidence of issues coming from the front line repeatedly failed to overturn the rigid assumptions held at the very top. Let's move into our final segment, Section 4, countering the invisible pull. Not courage, but structure. So we've diagnosed the illness, but what on earth is the cure? If gravity naturally pulls an organization off course, we have to build actual structural counterweights. You cannot just tell people to be braver. If decisions climb, you need explicit decision rights and formal protection for reasonable errors. But, notice that every counterweight introduces a new risk, like fragmented judgment. If information reassures, you must build formal challenge routes that legally obligate a response from leadership. But careful, if you don't actually act on those challenges, you're going to breed deep cynicism. If structures accumulate, you need explicit retirement dates for new rules. The big takeaway here, you have to alter the structural conditions around the behavior while keeping a really watchful eye on the new risks you just introduced. So, the absolute core message of this entire explainer really boils down to this brilliant quote. Counterweights must change the conditions around behavior, not merely demand courage. If your organizational system actively punishes bravery, demanding more courage from your employees isn't just useless, it is fundamentally unfair. You actually have to change the underlying architecture of authority and consequence. But, of course, this leaves us with a fascinating final puzzle. Every time an organization tries to counter this gravity, it implements new governance, new roles, new metrics. Over the years, these well-intentioned fixes just pile up. So I'll leave you with this really provocative thought from the text. What happens when the accumulated residue of all your previous reforms becomes a massive source of complexity in its own right? That's a concept known as transformation debt, and it's something we're going to have to explore next time. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and hey, keep questioning the gravity in your own workplace.